The room fell silent the moment it happened, not because someone shouted, not because a gun was drawn. Silence came because everyone instantly understood the gravity of the sin that had just been committed. In the world of organized power, there are rules that exist beyond written law, beyond contracts, beyond money. And above all of them stands one commandment that is never debated, never forgiven, and never misunderstood. You do not touch another man's family. What you are about to hear is not a story about rage. It is a story about restraint, about how true power does not erupt. It communicates, and how one single message, delivered without violence, forced an entire criminal organization to retreat in fear, clarity, and absolute submission. Before we go deeper, leave a comment with your thoughts as this story unfolds. Do you believe respect is stronger than fear? And if you value stories that reveal the unseen codes behind power, honor, and loyalty, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and join the conversation. The man at the center of this story was not reckless. He was not foolish. He was a made man protected by rank, history, and alliances. He believed that status insulated him from consequences. That belief is what destroyed him. It happened during a private charity dinner, the kind organized to create appearances of civility while hiding brutal realities beneath tailored suits and crystal glasses. The Godfather was present, calm as always, speaking little, observing everything. His wife sat beside him, dignified, reserved, untouchable. Everyone in the room understood that her presence was sacred. Everyone except one man. The mobster had been drinking, not enough to lose control, but enough to let arrogance surface. When he stood too close, when his hand lingered far longer than it should have, when familiarity crossed into violation, time slowed. Several men noticed instantly. No one moved. No one spoke, because this was not their moment. This was Don Vito Corleone's. His wife did not react outwardly. She did not scream, pull away dramatically, or seek protection. She simply stood, adjusted her posture, and returned to her seat. That alone should have warned everyone present. Because the calm of a Corleone woman is not weakness. It is confidence that justice does not need to be requested. Don Vito did not look at the man. He did not raise his voice. He did not interrupt the dinner. He finished his conversation, escorted his wife from the room, and left as if nothing had occurred. To the untrained eye, it looked like mercy. To those who understood the code, it was something far more terrifying. That night, there were no calls made in anger, no emergency meetings, no orders to hunt the offender down. Don Vito returned home, sat in his study, and listened. Because the first response of true power is always information. He learned everything: the man's alliances, his debts, his protections, and most importantly, who believed they could shield him. Only then did Don Vito act. The message he sent was not delivered by an enforcer. It came through a trusted intermediary, spoken calmly, respectfully, almost gently. There were no threats in the words themselves, no mention of punishment, no timeline, just a single statement, carefully chosen, heavy with meaning. The family of a man reflects his understanding of honor. That was it. Those words traveled faster than bullets. Within hours, every captain understood what they meant. The message was not for the offender alone. It was for everyone who had ever considered blurring the line between power and entitlement. Touching a wife was not a personal offense. It was a declaration of moral bankruptcy. Meetings were canceled. Protection was quietly withdrawn. Phone calls went unanswered. Men who once laughed with the offender now avoided his name. Because in this world, survival depends on alignment. And no one aligns against a man whose restraint is more feared than another's violence. The mobster waited for retaliation that never came. Days passed, then weeks. He began to realize the truth too late. Don Vito had not punished him. He had exposed him, stripped him of respect, isolated him, removed him from the invisible circle that sustains power. And that was only the beginning of what Don Vito intended to communicate. The organization was already retreating step by step, long before the final consequence arrived. And that consequence would not come with noise, blood, or spectacle, only inevitability. Isolation is the most efficient punishment a powerful man can inflict. Violence creates martyrs, fear creates resistance. But removal, silent, precise removal, leaves a man alone with the understanding of what he has lost. Don Vito Corleone understood this better than anyone. The offender began to notice the shift in subtle ways. Invitations stopped arriving. Seats once reserved for him at tables of influence were suddenly occupied by others. Deals he had been negotiating stalled without explanation. When he reached out to his usual contacts, responses were polite, distant, delayed. No one accused him. No one confronted him. That was the brilliance of it. Accusation invites defense. Silence invites realization. Behind closed doors, captains spoke in careful language. No one said his name directly. They did not need to. The offense had already become legend, not because it was dramatic, but because it violated something sacred. In their world, family was not a symbol. It was infrastructure. Undermine that, and the entire structure collapses. Don Vito never explained himself. He never justified his reaction. True authority does not argue. It establishes boundaries so clearly that explanation becomes unnecessary. By refusing to escalate publicly, he forced everyone else to confront the meaning of restraint. The message was unmistakable. If he could remain calm after such a violation, imagine what he was capable of when calm no longer served a purpose. The offender attempted to regain footing. He sent gifts. He arranged meetings. He tried to demonstrate loyalty, humility, regret. But remorse after a line is crossed carries no weight. In this code, some acts permanently redefine a man's standing. Apologies are for misunderstandings. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a declaration of disrespect. Meanwhile, Don Vito's household remained unchanged. His wife continued her routines, attended gatherings, received respect without ever mentioning the incident. That silence was intentional. Her dignity became part of the punishment. She did not need to speak because her presence itself reminded everyone of the standard that had been violated. What made the situation unbearable for the offender was uncertainty. There was no retaliation to prepare for, no enemy to face, no gun to watch for, only absence. And absence is terrifying to men who depend on recognition to exist. Rumors began to circulate, carefully shaped by those closest to Don Vito. Not lies, truths, positioned strategically. They spoke of honor, of lineage, of how a man's worth is measured not by what he can take, but by what he protects. These conversations were never framed as warnings. They were reflections. And reflections, when clear enough, force men to see themselves honestly. Other families took notice, not because they feared Don Vito's wrath, but because they admired his discipline. He had turned a private insult into a universal lesson without destabilizing alliances or spilling blood. That is the kind of leadership organizations survive under, the kind they obey willingly. The offender's crew began to fracture. Loyalty depends on confidence, and confidence had been quietly removed. Associates sought transfers. Soldiers requested reassignment. They did not want to be attached to a man already judged by the highest moral authority in their world. Guilt by association is a currency no one wants to pay. Still, Don Vito remained patient. Patience was not hesitation, it was timing. Every system eventually corrects itself when given the right pressure. And Don Vito applied pressure not by force but by allowing consequences to unfold naturally. The offender, desperate now, considered confrontation. He imagined demanding forgiveness, asserting his rank, invoking old favors, but deep down he understood the futility. To confront Don Vito would require acknowledging the offense aloud, something that would permanently mark him. Silence was his only remaining shield, and it was already failing. What he did not yet realize was that the message sent was never meant to end with him. It was meant to ripple outward, embedding itself into the collective memory of every man who witnessed the retreat. A reminder carved not into flesh, but into conscience. And soon, the final understanding would arrive, not as punishment, but as consequence, making it clear why touching family is not just forbidden, it is unforgivable. The moment a man realizes he no longer belongs is the moment fear fully settles in, not the loud, frantic kind, but the slow, suffocating certainty that every door is closing at once. That was the state the offender now lived in. He moved through rooms where conversations lowered when he entered. He shook hands that felt colder than before. Respect had not been taken from him violently. It had been quietly reassigned. Don Vito Corleone observed all of this from a distance. He did not interfere. He did not accelerate the process. Power, when properly applied, does not rush. It allows reality to teach the lesson on its own. The man had crossed a line that placed him outside the moral perimeter of the organization, and exclusion was simply the natural response. What mattered most was not the offense itself, but what it revealed. A man who touches another's family demonstrates a dangerous lack of discipline. If he cannot control his impulses in public, he cannot be trusted with secrets, negotiations, or lives. That is how Don Vito framed it privately, not as a personal betrayal, but as a structural flaw. And flaws cannot be ignored. Word spread that Don Vito had refused to accept compensation of any kind. No money, no favors, no symbolic gestures. This confused many, because in their world everything has a price. But this did not. By rejecting payment, Don Vito made something clear. Honor is not transactional. It is either present or absent, and once absent, it cannot be purchased back. Other leaders began to mirror his stance. The offender was no longer invited to joint discussions. His opinions were no longer sought. When he spoke, men listened out of politeness, not relevance. Influence, once lost, does not disappear suddenly. It erodes, grain by grain, until one day, nothing remains. His isolation became so complete that even enemies stopped acknowledging him. A man without backing is not worth opposing. He had become invisible, which in this world is worse than being dead. At least the dead are remembered. Don Vito's wife, meanwhile, continued to be treated with impeccable respect. Every greeting was formal, every interaction cautious, reverent, not because of fear, but because everyone now understood the weight she carried. She was not merely the wife of a powerful man. She was a living boundary, a reminder of where power ends and honor begins. Behind the scenes, Don Vito allowed one final message to circulate, not directed at the offender but at the structure itself. It was subtle, philosophical, almost reflective. A man who forgets why rules exist will eventually be destroyed by them. That sentence settled deeply into the culture. It reframed obedience not as submission, but as wisdom. The offender began to sense that no confrontation would ever come. No meeting, no verdict, no final words. This was not negligence. It was design. Don Vito had removed himself from the narrative entirely, forcing the man to confront the reality that he was no longer worth acknowledgement. Desperation breeds mistakes. The offender attempted to assert authority through intimidation, raising his voice, reminding others of his past contributions. But these efforts only accelerated his decline. Strength that must be announced is already gone. Every outburst confirmed what Don Vito already knew. The man was unfit. The crew, sensing instability, distanced themselves further. Loyalty flows toward certainty, not chaos. And Don Vito represented certainty in its purest form. Calm, unshaken, consistent. By contrast, the offender had become unpredictable, emotionally exposed. The retreat of the organization was now complete. Not a formal declaration, but a collective understanding. Lines had been redrawn without ink, boundaries reinforced without violence. The system had corrected itself. What remained was the final realization, not imposed by Don Vito but discovered by the offender himself. That touching family was never just an insult to one man. It was a confession of weakness. And in a world built on control, weakness is the one crime that cannot be survived. The full weight of that truth was about to settle in, and when it did, there would be no one left to hear his regret. There comes a moment when a man understands that the world he once navigated no longer exists for him, not because it vanished, but because he was quietly removed from it. The offender reached that moment alone, without witnesses, without confrontation, without drama, and that was precisely the point. Don Vito Corleone never sought to destroy the man. Destruction is simple. Anyone with enough force can eliminate a threat. What Don Vito sought was correction, not of one individual but of the code itself, a reminder written into behavior rather than blood. By now, the offender's access to resources had diminished. Credit lines evaporated. Protection became uncertain. Even neutral territory felt unsafe, not because someone would attack him, but because no one would intervene if something happened. That is the true meaning of retreat. Not pursuit, but abandonment. Other families took this as instruction. Without coordination, without meetings, they adjusted. This is how influence truly works. Orders decay as they travel. Principles do not. Don Vito had acted on principle, and the system aligned itself accordingly. What remained remarkable was what he did not do. He did not ban the man publicly. He did not declare him an enemy. He did not strip him of rank in a formal sense. Those actions would have drawn attention to the offense itself. Instead, Don Vito allowed dignity to remain intact, not for the offender's sake, but for the integrity of the code. Public humiliation cheapens justice. In private, Don Vito reflected on the incident not with anger, but with clarity. He understood that leadership is measured not by how often one asserts power, but by how rarely it must be displayed. If the rules are strong enough, enforcement becomes unnecessary. His wife never asked for vengeance. She never demanded explanation. Her trust in Don Vito's judgment was absolute, and that trust reinforced his resolve. In their world, partnership is not performative. It is silent alignment. As weeks passed, the offender's name stopped circulating entirely. That silence was deliberate. Names carry weight. To stop speaking a name is to remove it from relevance. In time, new conversations replaced old ones, and the system moved on. Lighter, more disciplined, more aware. Younger men noticed. They learned without being taught. They observed that power does not need to react emotionally to disrespect, that the strongest response to a violation is to make it unrepeatable, and nothing deters future transgressions more effectively than watching a man vanish socially without a single blow being struck. Don Vito's message had now completed its journey. From one inappropriate gesture, an entire culture had been reinforced. The line was no longer theoretical. It was proven. The offender, now fully aware of his position, understood something too late. Forgiveness had never been the issue. There was no anger to resolve, no apology to accept. The offense had simply placed him outside the boundaries of trust, and trust, once broken at that level, does not regenerate. He lived on, but without voice, without leverage, without allies. Every day served as a reminder that consequences do not always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive quietly and stay forever. Don Vito returned to his routines, unchanged. Meetings continued, alliances strengthened, the family endured, and that endurance was the final statement, not of dominance but of stability. Only one part of the story remained unfinished, not for Don Vito but for those watching. The understanding of why this response echoed far beyond one incident, and why, long after the man was forgotten, the lesson remained alive. That understanding would be sealed in the final words Don Vito never had to speak. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the conclusion of the incident. No confrontation, no public reckoning, no final act of violence to satisfy expectation, and yet, everyone understood that something permanent had been established, not through fear, but through certainty. Don Vito Corleone never referenced the offense again, not in private, not in strategy, not even in reflection. To him, the matter had resolved itself the moment the system responded correctly. When rules are internalized, leadership can step back. That is the highest form of control. The offender eventually left the city. Some said it was by choice. Others said it was necessity. The truth did not matter. What mattered was that his departure caused no reaction. No one followed. No one asked questions. No one filled the silence he left behind. His absence fit seamlessly into the order of things, as if he had never been essential at all. This is what Don Vito had sent back to the entire organization. Not a threat, not a punishment, a demonstration. He showed them that certain boundaries do not require enforcement because they are already understood by those worthy of power, and those who fail to understand them will naturally remove themselves. The story spread, not as gossip, but as principle, passed quietly between men who understood that power without discipline collapses under its own weight. That respect cannot be demanded after it is violated. That touching family is not merely an offense against a man, but against the structure that holds everything together. Don Vito's wife continued her life with the same grace she had always carried. Nothing about her changed, and that constancy was intentional. She did not need to be avenged because she had never been diminished. The strength of the response ensured that what endured was not the memory of the offender but the clarity of the line he crossed. Future generations would never need to test it. They had already seen the outcome. A man erased not by force, but by principle. This is why Don Vito Corleone was feared less than he was respected. Fear fades. Respect endures. And the men who last are the ones who understand the difference. True power does not shout. It does not rush. It does not explain itself. It sets a standard and allows the world to align or step aside. That was the message sent. And that is why the entire crew retreated, not because they were threatened, but because they understood. Honor sustains power, character sustains legacy, and the strongest men never need to prove it. They simply remain.